Wow, you guys have sent in a ton about autism lately,
Hmm.
especially wanting to know more about what it's like for adults. We've got adult autism and emotional flooding, autistic burnout at work,
Yeah.
even the toxic interaction between autism and narcissism. So it seems like you want to get past the typical stereotypes
Mhm.
and really understand what it's really like day to day. Am I getting that right?
Definitely. And that's what's missing, I think. There's so much emphasis on diagnosis and clinical stuff
Yeah,
that we forget about how it actually feels to live with it, you know?
totally. So let's jump right into this emotional flooding thing. It keeps popping up in what you've sent in. One article had this great analogy. They said, it's like when a glass of water suddenly overflows. What's going on in the brain when that happens?
It's such a good way to describe it because it captures how intense it can be. And the neuroscience behind it is fascinating. When we have strong emotions, parts of the brain, like the amygdala and hippocampus, light up. They're part of the limbic system, which is all about processing feelings and memories. But for some autistic people, the wiring in those areas might make them extra sensitive. So imagine those areas getting bombarded with sensory input or social information. It's like that water glass overflowing. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a real neurological reason for this. It's not just someone being overly sensitive or dramatic, like some people might think.
Exactly. And on top of that, you've got neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which regulate mood and stress responses. Research suggests they might function differently in some autistic individuals, which could make those emotional experiences even more intense.
That makes a lot of sense. One article had this quote that really stuck with me. An autistic adult said, "It's that overwhelming, suffocating feeling that can strike at any moment, leaving me feeling helpless and exhausted." It really shows how debilitating emotional flooding can be, what kinds of things usually trigger it.
Well, as we talked about, the brain's getting flooded with stuff it can't process. Sensory overload's a big one. Bright lights, loud noises, crowded places. But it's not just external things. Internal things can trigger it too, like social anxiety or struggling with executive function tasks.
Wait, hold on. What's executive function? Some people
It's,
might not know that term.
oh, sure. It's a set of mental skills we use for planning, organizing, focusing attention, and regulating emotions. And these can be tough for a lot of people on the spectrum. So imagine trying to do a complex task when your brain's already overloaded. That's a recipe for emotional flooding.
Okay, so we see how these triggers, both internal and external, can really pile up and lead to that overwhelming feeling.
Mhm.
So what can people DO when it happens? The articles you sent mentioned some techniques. What actually helps?
First, you got to recognize it's happening, like noticing the water levels getting close to the top of the glass. That awareness lets you step back mentally. So the wave of emotion doesn't just crash over you.
So you get some breathing room before it escalates.
Exactly. And then there are things you can do with your body to calm down your nervous system. Deep, controlled breathing is super helpful. And sensory grounding techniques, finding what works for you to soothe your senses.
Like what? What does the research say?
It's different for everyone because everyone's sensory profile is unique. If you're sensitive to sound, noise-canceling headphones might be a lifesaver. Others find deep pressure calming, so a weighted blanket or a hug could be really regulating. And for people who are visually sensitive, a quiet, dimly lit space can reduce overwhelm.
So it's about figuring out what works for you.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the simple stuff like fidget toys or calming music. The key is to have options ready when that flood starts rising.
That makes sense. And I think it's important to remember, you don't have to go through this alone. Reaching out to someone supportive can make a huge difference.
Yes. Social support is so important. Even just having someone validate your experience can be a huge help.
And this shows why self-advocacy is so crucial. Being able to tell people what's happening so they understand what you need in those moments.
Exactly. It's about saying, hey, this is what's going on in my brain right now, and this is what I need to feel safe and supported.
So we've covered emotional flooding pretty thoroughly. But the articles you sent also mentioned some other big parts of the autistic adult experience, like autistic burnout, toxic interactions,
Hmm.
and this thing called the autism tax. They all seem connected to emotional flooding in a way. Should we dive into those a bit?
Definitely. Those are all really important topics. They deserve their own deep dive. They're all part of what it means to be autistic. And understanding them can help us be more empathetic and supportive.
Okay, so let's switch gears and unpack those other areas. First up, autistic burnout. Seems pretty common, especially for adults trying to navigate a world that isn't always designed for neurodiversity. What does that actually look like? And how does it connect to emotional flooding?
Autistic burnout is like you hit a wall after running a marathon you didn't even sign up for. It's this deep exhaustion. And often it comes with even more trouble with social interaction, your senses feel even more intense, and executive functioning gets worse.
That sounds seriously draining. I'm guessing it's not just being tired after a long day.
Right, it's a much deeper kind of exhaustion. That affects every part of your life. It often comes after masking for a long time, trying to hide or suppress autistic traits to fit in with what people expect.
So it's like the constant effort
Mm,
of dealing with a world that doesn't always get it
Yeah.
or make space for neurodiversity.
Exactly, and it all ties back to emotional flooding. Because
Hmm.
that constant effort to manage your emotions and sensory input, to mask and try to fit in, it takes so much energy. After a while, it just depletes you, and you end up burnt out.
That makes a lot of sense. It really shows how interconnected all these challenges are. It's not just one thing. It's a whole bunch of experiences that feed into each other.
For sure, and we can't talk about autistic burnout without talking about the environment. Imagine being constantly bombarded with sensory input, facing social situations that totally overwhelm you, or struggling to meet demands that just don't work with your neurology. It's like trying to function in a world that's constantly throwing obstacles at you.
It sounds incredibly frustrating and disheartening.
Yeah.
So what can people who are experiencing burnout actually do? What helps?
Well, the first step is just recognizing and validating the experience. A lot of times, autistic people get told they're lazy or unmotivated, when really they're dealing with this intense exhaustion. It's essential to create space for rest and recovery. That might mean cutting back on social demands, prioritizing sensory regulation, and being kind to yourself. It's all about listening to your body and respecting its limits.
That sounds like good advice for anyone, really, but especially important for people experiencing burnout. Now, another topic that came up in the articles was toxic interactions, particularly within families. Can you talk about what that looks like and how it connects to emotional flooding?
It's sad but true. A lot of autistic individuals, especially adults, face negative or even abusive interactions with their families. It can come from a lack of understanding about autism, or just not accepting neurodiversity, or even deep-seated societal prejudices. And to make things worse, there's that power imbalance. That's just part of family relationships.
So we're talking about situations where family members might dismiss autistic traits
Yeah.
or even be critical and judgmental. I could see how that would be really hurtful and damaging.
Absolutely. And what's really tricky is that emotional flooding can make autistic people more vulnerable to manipulation or emotional abuse. When you're already struggling to regulate your emotions and navigate social situations, it's hard to stand up for yourself or set boundaries.
That's a crucial point. It shows why understanding the neuroscience of autism is so important for creating supportive environments.
Exactly. When families understand that emotional flooding is a neurological response, not a choice or a tactic, it can totally change things. It shifts from blame and judgment to compassion and support.
So what can autistic adults do to deal with these complicated family situations? The articles mention some strategies.
Setting clear boundaries is really important, even though it's super hard, especially with family. It might mean limiting contact with people who are always negative or dismissive, communicating your needs assertively, and getting support from therapists or autistic-led support groups. It's all about putting your well-being first and knowing that you deserve respect and understanding.
That's a powerful message, and it emphasizes the importance of self-advocacy and finding support outside your immediate family.
Absolutely. It's about finding your tribe, connecting with people who get it, and can offer you validation and a sense of belonging.
Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about is the autism tax. I've heard that term before, but I'm not totally sure what it includes.
Think of it as the hidden costs of living in a world made for neurotypical brains. It's all the extra work, energy, and resources that autistic people have to put in just to get through daily life.
Do you give us some examples?
Sure, it could be something small, like needing to buy noise-canceling headphones to deal with sensory overload in public, or paying for specialized therapy or coaching that insurance won't cover. It can also be about the mental and emotional energy of masking your autistic traits, managing social anxiety, or figuring out complex systems that aren't designed for neurodivergent ways of thinking.
So it's like the total effect of constantly adjusting and accommodating.
Exactly, and it can be a huge burden, both financially and emotionally. It's another layer of complexity that
Wow.
often goes unnoticed.
I'm starting to see how all these things connect. Emotional flooding, autistic burnout, toxic interactions, and the autism tax. They're all intertwined, creating this web of challenges for autistic adults. It's a lot to process. How do we connect all this to the bigger picture? What can we actually do to change the narrative and make the world more inclusive for neurodivergent individuals?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think it starts with recognizing that disability isn't just a personal thing, it's also a social construct. It's about the barriers we create, the
Mm.
expectations we have, and the ways we limit opportunities and access.
So it's about looking beyond individual differences and examining the systems that create disadvantage.
Exactly. And that leads us to double empathy. One of the articles
I
mentioned
was
that.
hoping we'd get to that. I've heard the term before,
Oh.
but I'd love to hear your take on it.
It's the idea that communication often breaks down because autistic and non-autistic people are coming at communication from completely different places. It's not that one group is right and the other is wrong. It's about recognizing that there are different ways of seeing and interacting with the world.
So instead of making autistic people learn how to communicate like neurotypical people, it's about finding ways to understand each other and connect across those differences.
Exactly. It's about creating space for mutual respect and realizing that communication goes both ways. We have to meet each other halfway, be patient with each other, and be open to learning from each other's perspectives.
I love that. Building bridges, not walls. It really resonates with me. And it seems especially relevant to what we were talking about with toxic interactions in families. Building understanding within families could make a huge difference.
For sure. It starts with open communication, active listening, and being willing to challenge assumptions and biases.
Now, before we finish up this part of the conversation, I want to go back to something you said earlier about the importance of listening to autistic voices. I think that's crucial. Why is that so important?
Autistic people are the experts on their own experiences. They're the ones who live with the challenges and navigate a world that's not built for them. Their voices need to be at the center of everything. Research, policy, advocacy.
So it's about moving beyond awareness to action.
Exactly. It's not enough to just know these challenges exist. We need to create spaces where autistic voices can be heard, where their perspectives matter, and where their needs are met.
So if we were to sum up all of this, what's the main thing you want our listeners to take away?
I think it comes down to this. Understanding is the key to a more inclusive world for autistic people. It's about moving past stereotypes and assumptions and really grasping what it's like to experience neurodiversity.
Understanding things like emotional flooding, autistic burnout, toxic interactions, and the autism tax.
Right. And knowing that this understanding is a journey that never ends. There's always more to learn, more ways to grow in our empathy and allyship.
And that knowledge is empowering. The more we understand, the better we can advocate for change, create supportive environments, and break down the systemic barriers that create inequality.
Absolutely. It's about shifting away from this idea that autism is something that needs to be fixed or cured and moving towards a strengths-based approach, one that celebrates neurodiversity and values the unique contributions
Yeah.
of autistic individuals.
I love that. Celebrating neurodiversity, recognizing the different ways of thinking, processing information, and experiencing the world are not deficits, but valuable assets that enrich our society.
Precisely. When we embrace neurodiversity, we open ourselves up to new possibilities, new perspectives, new ways of solving problems.
Okay, so before we wrap up entirely, I want to leave everyone with something to think about. Based on what we've talked about today, we learned about the neuroscience of emotional flooding, how it's an actual neurological response, not just a behavior problem. So how does that change how we see meltdowns, or what some people might call challenging behaviors?
That's such an important question. If we accept that these behaviors often come from a neurological response to overwhelm, does that make us more compassionate and supportive?
Does it change how we react in those situations? Does it lead us to find solutions that address the underlying needs, instead of just trying to control the behavior?
Those are really important questions to consider, and they highlight the need to change how we think about and interact with autistic individuals. It's about moving away from fixing or changing them and towards creating environments where they can thrive, where their differences are celebrated, and where their needs are met with understanding and support.
That's a great place to end, I think. This has been a deep dive into the world of the adult autistic experience. We've covered emotional flooding, autistic burnout, toxic interactions, the autism tax, and so much more. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about autism, the better we can challenge stereotypes, advocate for change, and create a world that truly embraces neurodiversity.
And that journey of understanding starts with each of us. Keep exploring the articles you send us. Connect with autistic-led organizations and communities. And keep asking questions. Keep learning and keep challenging your own assumptions.
You're not alone in this. There's a whole community out there ready to connect, support, and advocate for a world that celebrates. the amazing richness and diversity of human experience.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something valuable and feel inspired to keep exploring the world of neurodiversity.